Boom, and just like that, it is week 8 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 8 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have 6 teams on bye week here in week 8 of the season, the first of one of the bye-apocalypses here in the 2025 season. So the Cardinals, the Lions, the Jaguars, the Raiders, the Rams, and the Seahawks will all be on bye week. Some big name wide receivers missing here in week 8. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We will have the Vikings traveling to face the Chargers. Let's start with the Vikings. Justin Jefferson felt like a bit of a down week in week 7. 12.9 fantasy points, 10 targets, 5 catches, 79 receiving yards. But this was still a good game where a majority of the game we saw Justin Jefferson shadowed by Quinyon Mitchell. So it wasn't necessarily a great matchup for him in week 7. And ultimately, when we look to this week 8 matchup, the Chargers have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, top 8 against the position in terms of fantasy points allowed. But it's Justin Jefferson. You got to roll with him. And, you know, I've been a bit superstitious about Thursday Night Football matchups this year because historically they're not always great. But Thursday Night Football has been really high scoring so far on the season. So I think this is a good spot for Justin Jefferson. We just saw the Chargers give up a big offensive day to the Indianapolis Colts. Michael Pittman found the end zone. So JJ, come on, you're starting him no matter what. And I've moved Jordan Addison up to the start category as well. I mean, we were kind of looking at him as like a strong flex for a week or two, and I have encouraged you guys to start him if you needed to over the last 3 weeks, but we've seen no fewer than 15.1 fantasy points out of Jordan Addison in his 3 games on the season, and he just had 21.8 fantasy points against the Eagles in week 7, 12 targets, 9 catches, 128 receiving yards, 21.8 fantasy points, led the team in total receiving yards. You got to feel good if you drafted Jordan Addison late. You held on to him. He's looking like a very solid start on a week-to-week basis. You are more than likely flexing him or starting him as a wide receiver too, maybe with the buys going on, but still, he's a start and you got to feel good about him. I don't know if it's going to be JJ McCarthy or if it's going to be Carson Wentz here in week 8, but I feel like it's going to be Carson Wentz, and he seemed to really like targeting Jordan Addison this past week. So think that we just go ahead and roll with these Minnesota Vikings wide receivers and feel good. Now, we go to the Chargers wide receivers. I encourage you guys to view all 3 Chargers wide receivers last week as low-end starts, and I talked a lot about that matchup against the Colts. It was a great spot for them, and we basically saw all 3 Chargers wide receivers come through with, at worst, very solid games. Quentin Johnston found the end zone, so he saved his fantasy day off of 2 catches with 11 fantasy points. Ladd McConkey, 15.7 fantasy points. He had 15 targets, 9 catches, 67 receiving yards. And Keenan Allen had the biggest day, 28.9 fantasy points, 14 targets, 11 catches, 119 receiving yards, and a touchdown. The problem here is on a week-to-week basis, we don't exactly know what the volume is going to look like. Maybe QJ didn't get as much involvement this past week because he was coming off the injury. But right now, I mean, this Chargers offense is kind of forced to throw the football. Their defense is not playing as great. Their running backs are hurt. They have offensive lineman injuries. And ultimately, Herbert threw the football 55 times this past week. I don't know if that's particularly going to happen against the Vikings this week, and the Vikings have been pretty good, top 5 against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed, but they're all still low-end starts. Ceilings are capped due to the involvement of each 3 of the receivers, and we haven't even mentioned Oronde Gadsden at the tight end position, who had a massive game as well this past week, but it's looking like a pass-first offense until further notice, so you can roll with any Chargers wide receiver here in week 8 of the season. And I still think Jordan Addison is being really underrated going into week 8 of the season. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on his receiving yard line, sitting at 57.5. total receiving yards. He has smashed that in 2 of his first 3 starts on the season. He gets a good matchup against the Chargers here in week 8 of the season. So I'm taking it. And don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 8 NFL action. Take that free pick'em. Take Addison's over on receiving yards. If both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog's also going to give you $50 in bonus cash if you sign up using promo code THECATCH once you play through $5 on Underdog. And they're going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 8 exclusive NFL offers. All right, moving into Sunday's action, let's start with the early window. There's no London games this weekend, no early morning games, so Dolphins, Falcons to kick things off. And let's go ahead and start with Jalen Waddle. I'm still viewing him as a low-end start. Going into week 7, I know he was very bad this past week, 2.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, just 1 catch, 15 receiving yards, but the passing game was just awful, non-existent for the Dolphins this past week. Tua only had 100 passing yards, 3 interceptions, only completed 12 total passes. And I don't particularly love this spot against the Falcons on the road here in week 8. And this is a Falcons unit that's allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. So low end start because we got a lot of bye weeks, a lot of stuff going on, and you got to expect some positive regression coming here in week 8 because it can't get worse than it was this past week, right? I hope not. And it was a tough defense against the Browns this past week, tough defense in the Falcons this week. We'll see what happens, but low end start, maybe fringe flex player here in week 8. Then we move to Drake London. I have him as a low-end start as well because it's just really tough to call Drake London on a week-to-week basis. Like big week 4, big week 6, low ceiling this past week, 8.2 fantasy points. Outside of weeks 4 and 6 on the season, he's at 13.5 or less fantasy points in every game on the season. So it feels like if he doesn't score, we're not getting like a huge output. And the Dolphins are a top 10 unit against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed, maybe because they give up so many fantasy points to the running back position, but still, we got to look at that ranking and not feel particularly great about it. But I still think this is a good spot for the Falcons at home. I know they were pretty underwhelming overall this past week, but you still got to feel pretty good here if you own Drake London. And in terms of any other Falcons wide receiver, there's nobody here that I would recommend even thinking about starting. And Ray-Ray McCloud was inactive this past week and could potentially be on the move, potentially to a different team. We'll find out. But yeah, Darnell Mooney, just not enough this past week. So Drake London, Jalen Waddle, the only players I would consider at the wide receiver position in this matchup, and they're just low-end starts. Except we have the Bears who are traveling to face the Ravens. Roma Dunze, what's going on here? 5.2 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games, and these have been pretty good matchups against the Commanders and the Saints in the first 4 weeks of the season before that week 5 bye. A lot of value out of Roma Dunze, a lot of red zone looks. Through that stretch, he had a total of 5 touchdowns, a ceiling of 31.8 fantasy points. What exactly has changed? Well, this offense is running the football a lot more since that bye week, right? I mean, we saw 30 or more total passing attempts for Caleb Williams 3 out of the first 4 games on the season. And since the bye week, he's had 29 or less passing attempts in those first 2 games since their bye week, right? And DeAndre Swift is running the football at ease over the past 2 weeks. And it's another great matchup for the running back position this week against the Ravens, so we could continue to see that, but it's also a great matchup for the wide receiver position. So I don't want to panic here. I don't want to overthink it, especially with all the bye weeks. If you own Roma Dunze, I know I said last week was a great bounce back spot, and it should have been. But here again, in week 8, it's a great bounce back spot. So I'm still viewing Roma Dunze as a start. When it comes to DJ Moore, I've moved him out of like the risky flex area. I mean, he scored a touchdown against the Dallas Cowboys in week 3, the team giving up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season so far. Outside of that, he's done nothing this year. 9.6 or less fantasy points in every other game. And once again, that week 3 performance, his ceiling is 12.8 fantasy points. There's always a chance he can score, but you cannot trust DJ Moore, who's not even a top 50 wide receiver right now in fantasy scoring, in your starting lineup. So I am just sitting DJ Moore, and we can continue to keep eyes on Luther Burden, but only had 2 targets and 1 catch this past week, so you can stash him or whatever, but we're not starting him anytime soon. All right, the Ravens are coming off of their bye week. They get this home game performance, and they should get Lamar Jackson back. We're not entirely sure on that. If it is Lamar Jackson at quarterback, I think you got to feel good about Zay Flowers. This is still a good matchup. The Bears have improved somewhat defensively, but they're still ranking 24th overall against the wide receiver position in fantasy points scored. So I think Zay Flowers is a solid start, but obviously his value is going to be determined by who's the starting quarterback in week 8 here for the Ravens. Hopefully we get Lamar Jackson back. Football is much better with Lamar Jackson on the field. In terms of any other Ravens wide receiver, I just have no interest. Rashad Bateman, DeAndre Hopkins, anybody else on this roster, just no thank you. So Flowers, I'll leave as a start. Maybe he's more of like a low-end start when we really look at his stats on the season so far. But once again, you got to still feel good about this matchup against the Bears here in Week 8. Next up, we have the Jets, who will travel to face the Bengals. Let's start with the Jets. Well, really the only question here is Garrett Wilson going to play or not? He missed Week 7 dealing with that knee injury. Looks like the reports are indicating he is hopeful to play in Week 8, so there is a chance. But bear in mind, the Jets are on bye week in Week 9, so there could be a push here for Garrett Wilson just to rest through the bye week. The Jets are also the worst team in the NFL, so there could certainly be a push for their best player to actually be on the field. Then we don't know who the starting quarterback this week is going to be. Is it going to be Justin Fields? Is it going to be Tyrod Taylor? At this point, I think I feel better if it's Tyrod Taylor and he has a full week to prepare, and it's a good matchup this week against the Bengals. So I don't know if it's Justin Fields, if it's Tyrod Taylor. I'm still starting Garrett Wilson because I still believe, his talent outweighs the situation here. He played bad in Week 2. The whole offense played bad in Week 2. He played bad in Week 6. The whole offense played bad in Week 6. And, he had Pat Surtain on him in that game. Outside of that, he's had 19 or more fantasy points and has scored a touchdown in every other game. So I'm not losing faith here. I will say, we think about this Bengals defense and we're like, oh my gosh, the worst defense ever. Well, they've given up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season, so bear that in mind. They are giving up a lot of total receiving yardage, a fair amount of receptions, but they haven't given up a lot of receiving touchdowns on the season. Part of that is because they give up a lot of rushing touchdowns to the running back position, but just bear that in mind for what it's worth. But yeah, Garrett Wilson plays, I'm starting him regardless of the quarterback situation. Any other wide receiver on this team, no thank you. Under no circumstances would I start them. All right, last week we kept Jamar Chase as a start, and we had T. Higgins in the flex spot. And that was coming off of, solid enough performances in Week 6, but we also trusted them in Week 6, and we're going to continue to trust them here in Week 8 as we did over the past 2 weeks, including Week 7. Huge week for Jamar Chase in Week 7 in the Unk Bowl, 38.1 fantasy points, his best on the season. Scored a touchdown, 23 targets, 16 catches, 161 receiving yards, and T. Higgins showed up as well. He found the end zone, could have scored a second touchdown, decided not to, which made sense for winning the game. Did not make sense for our fantasy lineups, though, but that's okay. 10 targets, 6 catches, 96 receiving yards, 21.6 fantasy points. His best fantasy performance on the year. Now, bear in mind, they get the Jets this week. Sauce Gardner is probably going to line up on Jamar Chase. The Jets, for as bad as they are, they're still a top 10 unit against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. So just keep that in mind. It's probably not going to be as high scoring as last week's game, but you got to feel good with Flacco at quarterback. He's at least getting the football where it needs to be in terms of these 2 wide receivers, and he has thrown the football at least 45 times in each of his 2 starts with the Bengals. So I'm going to start my studs in this matchup across the board. Chase, Higgins, and Garrett Wilson, all looking like solid starts here in Week 8. Moving along, we got the Bills, who are going to travel to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Bills, fresh off of their bye week. And, I kind of view this Bills wide receiver room the same way every single week. Khalil Shakir is a low-end start, maybe arguably just a flex play. Keon Coleman is just a sit for me. If he scores a touchdown, you probably are happy with your week, but he's only done that twice on the season, and in games where he has not scored a touchdown, he's had 7.5 or less fantasy points. Huge, risky flex if you're desperate, and you better cross your fingers he finds the end zone. Josh Palmer has been banged up. Not clear if he's going to play this week, but if he does, he's a sit for me. And there's really nobody else here, and that's like the only reason Khalil Shakir sees some of these safe floors. He's had 6.3 or less fantasy points in 2 games on the year, 11 or more fantasy points in the other 4 games he's played in on the season. So low-end start, but bear in mind, this Panthers defense is nothing to sneeze at, and they, on the season, have given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So low-end start, and that is it. Then we moved to T-Mac, who kind of came back to earth after finally having a game where he scored a touchdown, and actually 2 touchdowns in Week 6. Just 6.3 fantasy points this past week, but Bryce Young was awful. He got banged up dealing with, an ankle issue, and now we don't know if it's going to be Bryce Young or Andy Dalton this week. And we saw Sauce Gardner on T-Mac, right? So 5 targets, 3 catches, 33 receiving yards, 6.3 fantasy points. The Bills have come in top 10 against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I don't love this matchup, and I think with kind of the question mark at quarterback and all of that, when it's looking like it is going to be Andy Dalton this week more than likely, which could be good for T-Mac, don't get me wrong. It could also be bad. Ultimately, I just have T-Mac as a low-end start, and that's really what he's been throughout the majority of the season, and I think that's unfortunately where he's going to be just due to the nature of this offense, unless we see really soft matchups like we saw in terms of like the Dallas Cowboys in Week 6. So T-Mac, low-end start. Khalil Shakir, also a low-end start. We'll see what happens here in Week 8. We will have the Niners traveling to face the Texans. Let's go ahead. Start with the Niners, another team where we just have no idea what's going on a week-to-week basis outside of the fact that Christian McCaffrey is probably going to play very good football. So Kendrick Bourne came back to earth this past week. Tough matchup against the Falcons, just 3.4 fantasy points, 2 targets, 2 catches, 14 receiving yards. Ricky Pearsall was out in Week 7. Jawan Jennings was alive and active, 7.1 fantasy points, 7 targets, 4 catches, 31 receiving yards. But on a week-to-week basis, I just can't trust these Niners wide receivers. It looks like Brock Purdy is trending towards returning this week, but we could also see Mac Jones again, and I don't particularly love this matchup against the Texans. They've been very good against opposing wide receivers on the year. They have a stout front 7 as well, so with the Niners on the road here, I just don't love any Niners wide receivers. I'm leaving them all as risky flexes because, once again, we just don't know who's playing, who's not playing. We know George Kittle is back at the tight end position and that he should get some volume. I know he didn't get any volume this past week, but that will change. And he still was great in terms of his impact on the game and run blocking and everything. But, yeah, week-to-week basis, I don't really do these Niners wide receivers other than call them risky flexes. And we're getting pretty close to where we're just going to start straight up sitting some of these guys. But there is value always in a Kyle Shanahan system. I would say they're very risky flexes. They're close to a sit due to the matchup and dependent on if Mac Jones is the starting quarterback or not here in Week 8. All right, I am recording this video before Monday Night Football has been played, so if Nico Collins breaks his leg or something, don't hate me. There'll be a pinned comment down below, if my thoughts here change on the Texans. But yeah, I'm expecting Nico Collins to have a solid game overall in Week 7 on the road against the Seahawks and at least leave with a safe floor. He's at 11.9 or more fantasy points in 4 of the first 5 games on the season. I think he'll continue to be solid going into Week 8. So if you guys own Nico Collins, as long as he's healthy, I'm starting him in this matchup against the Niners. Not a great matchup against the Niners, but once again, it's Nico Collins with all the bye weeks and stuff. You're starting Nico Collins no matter what. Christian Kirk missed week 7, and maybe that impacts another Texans wide receiver positively like Jalen Noel or Xavier Hutchinson, but I'm just not doing it with any of these Texans wide receivers until we see something on a consistent basis, and Christian Kirk can't stay healthy. The rookie wide receivers here aren't necessarily consistent. Nobody wants Xavier Hutchinson in their starting lineup, so is Nico Collins or nobody else when it comes to the Texans wide receivers here in week 8 of the season. Except we got the Browns traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with the Browns. I've said it for a few weeks now. I'm not starting any Browns wide receiver. Jerry Jeudy had 3.7 fantasy points this past week. Isaiah Bond had 0 fantasy points. He also saw his snaps overall decrease. Cedric Tillman, is still on IR. There's other names I could go over here, but I'm not going to waste your time. We're just not starting any Browns wide receivers, and I got a bad feeling about this road matchup for the Browns offense going up against this Patriots unit. They haven't been great against opposing wide receivers, but I just think it's going to be a good day for the Patriots offense and defense, and not a great day for the Browns. So we move to the Patriots wide receivers. I mean, the Browns do have a good defense. Don't get me wrong. They've been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, top 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed, but the Patriots are one of the pass heaviest teams in the league. They're moving the football through the air with success, and ultimately I do think the Browns defense will be good enough to kind of slow down the run game, being that it's Ramondre Stevenson and whoever else is on this team, not named Trayvon Henderson apparently, but I do think that the Patriots are going to have success throwing the football, even if it's not particularly their best overall day throwing the football. So Stephon Diggs, 13.9 fantasy points this past week, 7 targets, caught all of them for 69 receiving yards. Nice. So we got to keep Stephon Diggs in our starting lineup. Good low-end start. Nothing crazy here, but he should be solid. Then Kayshon Boutte, I still think is a good risky flex. 3 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks, 13.5 or more fantasy points in the past 2 weeks. His volume is still pretty low, so like there's risk here for sure, but he is one of these players that has built some pretty good trust with Drake May, so I still like Kayshon Boutte. Anybody else here? Way too risky. We're pushing it. So Diggs, probably the only start I feel super comfortable with in this matchup, and even then his ceiling is not going to be high, but Kayshon Boutte does have some flex appeal as we move into week 8. Last game of the early window will be the Giants traveling to face the Eagles in a little rematch from what we got 2 weeks ago on Thursday Night Football. So let's start with the Giants. Rondell Robinson has shown up big time over the last 2 weeks. 15.5 fantasy points in week 7 against the Denver Broncos secondary. I mean, this is as good of a stat line as you can ask for the wide receiver one going up against Pat Surtain and the Denver Broncos, who on the season I've given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, I know how Robinson lines up. Pat Surtain wasn't on him like every single snap or anything, but I was too worried to even start Robinson this past week, but 12 targets, 6 catches, 95 receiving yards. He had 20 fantasy points and a touchdown in week 6 against the Eagles, so he's a low-end start. Bear in mind, Quinyon Mitchell got banged up in week 6, wasn't really on the field for a majority of the game, so Robinson was able to kind of slide through with a better of all day. But yeah, I could see Robinson getting you guys, 12, 13, 14 fantasy points. If he scores a touchdown, probably more. So he's still a low-end start. Anybody else here? Darius Slayton has been banged up. He's missed the past 2 weeks. Jalen Hyatt, Lil Jordan Humphrey, whoever it is, there's just not enough here from a fantasy standpoint, so they're all going to be sits and way too risky overall. All right, we move to the Eagles wide receivers. I have encouraged you guys to have some faith here. Keep these guys in your lineup as flex options, as wide receiver 2 options potentially. And, it has been frustrating, but this past week, 28.1 fantasy points for A.J. Brown, 2 touchdowns off of 4 catches, 121 receiving yards. And Devonta Smith had a touchdown, 183 receiving yards, 11 targets, 9 catches, 33.3 fantasy points for Devonta Smith. So both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith are coming off of their best fantasy performances on the season so far. And bear in mind, the Giants are still a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers on the season when it comes to fantasy points allowed. And before Monday Night Football has been played, and I don't think looking at the numbers here that this will even change, but just in case, they have given up the most receiving yardage 2 wide receivers of any team in the league so far. So I know 2 weeks ago wasn't necessarily great, but don't forget A.J. Brown had 14 points. Devonta Smith had 8.9, and Jalen Hurts missed him on that, go-ahead huge touchdown that could have happened. So I still like both these players this week. I think they should ultimately be in your starting lineups. You shouldn't be thinking twice about it. So you own A.J. Brown, you own Devonta Smith, just get them in your lineup. It's a great matchup. And Rondell Robinson has come through in recent weeks. Looks like him and Jackson Dart have a good chemistry, so he is also a solid start here in Week 8. All right, moving into the afternoon window, we're going to have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Saints. And I will say this is a tough one for me to really break down without Monday Night Football having been played. Looks like Mike Evans is going to play in Week 7, but even at the time I'm recording this, a few hours before Monday Night Football has been played, he has not been ultimately cleared to actually play. So yeah, this one's a little bit rough here. We also don't know the status of Emeka Egbuka going in to Week 8. And technically, once again, he has a chance to play in Week 7. So there's that as well. And then Chris Godwin, I think, is likely to miss Week 8, but he could technically play. So yeah, it's a big old question mark. And they're all just kind of like in the risky flex category because we just don't know who's playing and how the volume is going to shake out because of who is playing and who's not playing. But I would encourage you guys, if you have a healthy Mike Evans or a healthy Emeka Egbuka, I think that they have to be in your starting lineups. The Saints have moved up in their overall ranking against wide receivers. They're kind of middle of the pack right now, but yeah, you just got to roll with these guys if you own them and if they're healthy. Chris Godwin is the one that I'm just not ready to start right now, unless you're absolutely desperate. He's probably just in the sit category. But yeah, then we look at like Tez and Cameron Johnson, Sterling Shepard. How are those guys impacted? I just don't know. It's too early to tell. And I don't even know if Monday Night Football will give us any clarification here. So Evans, Egbuka, good enough to get in your guys' lineup, obviously, if they're healthy. But outside of that, I'm just kind of in a big kind of question mark here when it comes to these Bucs wide receivers. So hopefully as the week progresses here, we'll get some more clearer answers for you guys. Of course, you can drop all your fantasy questions on any of the videos throughout the week as things kind of clear up here, and I'll get back to you guys as well. All right. Chris Olave is moving up to the start category. We've had him as a low-end start every single week, and I talked about it in last week's video. Like, you know exactly what you're going to get out of Chris Olave. You probably feel good if you own him, but the ceiling's just not high. He only scored 1 touchdown on the season. Well, maybe he watched last week's start-sit video or something. 2 receiving touchdowns, 7 targets, 5 catches, 98 receiving yards, 26.8 fantasy points. His best performance on the season so far. Good enough matchup here against the Bucs. It's not the best. It's not the worst, but you got to feel good if you own Chris Olave. I mean, he's getting the most volume of any wide receiver on this team. I know Shaheed technically had more targets this past week, but overall on the season, we're looking at 71 targets to Olave and then just 45 to Shaheed. And see a little bit of involvement from Jawan Johnson this past week after he had basically faded into being non-existent. So I guess that's there. But yeah, Olave is a leading receiver on this offense, undoubtedly. And Spencer Rattler is still throwing the football quite a bit, 32 total passing attempts this past week. So, yeah, I think you own Chris Olave. You got to start him, and you probably feel good. Shaheed just lives in the risky flex category. He's like Jamison Williams or, like a Matthew Golden. Like, these are just the risky flexes that you never know when they're going to pop off on a week-to-week basis. But the upside is there. So if you own Shaheed, you could flex him, but just tamper expectations. You never know what's going to happen. And yeah, this one, unfortunately, a little bit tough to call this early in the week, but we'll see what happens here in Week 8 of the season. All right, next up, we have the Titans traveling to face the Colts. All right. Not a lot to really touch on here. Calvin really missed this past week in Week 7. Don't know if he's going to play in Week 8 or not. I also don't care. Cam Ward has been awful. 255 passing yards this past week. Did throw 1 touchdown. Also threw an interception. Also had a lost fumble. I mean, at least he's thrown a touchdown in the last 2 games, but in that stretch, he has 2 picks and 3 lost fumbles as well. The passing attack here is just absolutely anemic. I will say the Colts are one of the worst teams in the league in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. Actually, as a matter of fact, they are the worst team in the league terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. They're about 55 yards behind the Giants in terms of total yardage allowed, and they've allowed 9 total touchdowns on the season to the wide receiver position in terms of receiving touchdowns. So they're bad. And we talked about it all last week with the Chargers facing them. Like the secondary is giving up a lot of fantasy points. You know, they're good against quarterbacks. They're good against running backs. They're not good against wide receivers ultimately. So they maybe are presenting a good matchup to the Titans wide receivers, but I'm not going to recommend you guys start any of these players. L.K. Manor, 4.9 fantasy points this past week. Tyler Lockett, 3.8. Don't care if Ridley's healthy or not. I'm sitting the Titans wide receivers across the board. I think they're going to have a very tough day offensively here in week 8. Michael Pittman did find the end zone in week 7, 20.8 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 catches, 58 receiving yards. And yeah, I mean, the Titans have ultimately moved up a little bit in terms of their overall ranking against wide receivers. And they're getting worse and worse against opposing running backs, but still a bottom 12 unit against opposing wide receivers. Pittman on the season so far has 5 receiving touchdowns, wide receiver 10 at the time we're recording this. Keep rolling with them. He's a must-start wide receiver at this point in the season. Josh Downs, dealing with that concussion, was inactive this past week. Kind of disappointing after he had pretty good stretch of 2 games, had finally scored his first touchdown on the season. If he's healthy, I still think he's in the flex category. Should see enough volume here that he's relevant. Alec Pierce showed up this past week, but we can never really trust Alec Pierce. Plus, if Josh Downs is back, he's going to be the wide receiver 2 here. A.D. Mitchell shouldn't even be on the screen, but he did have 1 target this past week. So there is that. He did have 1 catch, but yeah, he's basically irrelevant at this point in the season. So Pittman, feel good here in this matchup. We'll see if Josh Downs plays. Everybody else going to be sits across the board. Okay, next up, we got the Cowboys traveling to face the Broncos. This is going to be a good week 8 matchup, and we definitely got a couple things to discuss here. So let's start with CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. I have them both in the start category. I just don't know how you can bench these guys. I know Pickens, it was a lower ceiling, 6 targets, 4 catches, 82 receiving yards, 12.2 fantasy points. And now that we have CeeDee Lamb back, it's going to impact Pickens. But if you guys watch, I mean, Pickens was catching everything that Prescott threw his way. He made some great catches in that game. He's still a big part of this offense. I know it's frustrating because he scored a touchdown in every game between weeks 2 and week 6. And ultimately, you got kind of used to that. Now CeeDee Lamb is back in the mix. 8 targets, 5 catches, 110 receiving yards, a touchdown, 22 fantasy points for Lamb this past week. But these guys are still going to be very solid starts on a week-to-week basis. The elephant in the room is that they are playing the Denver Broncos, who we talked about a few moments ago. They've given up the fewest fantasy points on the season to opposing wide receivers. They've only given up 1 receiving touchdown to wide receivers so far on the season. So it's a tough matchup. Pat Surtain's going to be on CeeDee Lamb. Maybe that's good for Pickens. But ultimately, well, I generally don't recommend starting wide receivers against a player like Pat Surtain. This is the type of wide receiver that you just start no matter what, even against a player like Pat Surtain. So CeeDee Lamb staying in my starting lineups undoubtedly, and George Pickens still a very, very solid start. On weeks where Pickens scores touchdowns, we're going to see those ceilings again, but the floor is still very safe here. All right, Courtland Sutton was one of my favorite players last week. He came through for you guys, 16.7 fantasy points. It's kind of frustrating with how many points the Broncos put up to see him not score a touchdown, but 10 targets, 6 catches, 87 receiving yards, and now he gets the Cowboys. They've given up the second most fantasy points, to opposing wide receivers so far on the season. 12 total receiving touchdowns. They've given up the most receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers on this season, and they are only behind the Colts and the Giants in total yardage allowed to opposing wide receivers. So yeah, Courtland Sutton, we are firing him up on all cylinders. I know Marvin Mims had a nice game this past week, but you can't trust him. I know Troy Franklin found the end zone on that kind of ricochet pass off of Sutton, but yeah, we can't trust these guys in our starting lineups. They're way, way too volatile, and Pat Bryant's basically irrelevant. So Courtland Sutton, great start this week, and you got to trust the Cowboys wide receivers here in week 8. Next up, we got the Packers traveling to face the Steelers on Sunday Night Football. Let's start with the Packers side of things. I'm leaving Romeo Doubs as a risky flex, which is maybe unfair. Maybe he's closer to a low-end start, but he's going to get Jalen Ramsey in this game. I know Ramsey was just getting absolutely cooked by Jamar Chase, but is Romeo Doubs, Jamar Chase? Not really, but I do like Doubs this week. He sits at 73% rostered, so some of you guys out there, if you're hurting at wide receiver, maybe you can go out to the waiver and grab him, but this is more than likely a bench play for most of you guys. Pretty safe floor here. If he finds the end zone, you're going to feel good. But he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 4 this season. But yeah, I mean, the Steelers ranked 27th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, so they're not good. And they just got absolutely lit up in the Unk Bowl. So I think Doubs, I left him as a risky flex. Kind of regret. I think he's probably closer to a low-end start this week, especially with all the bye weeks. But it's just the nature of this offense. You never know what you're going to get out of these Packers wide receivers, but Doubs is certainly probably the closest thing to consistency overall. Matthew Golden, probably just a risky flex. 7.7 fantasy points this past week, 4 targets, 4 catches, 37 receiving yards. Ultimately, I still think Golden is playable here, but you just don't know what you're going to get. He did have 10 or more fantasy points in the previous 3 games, so startable but risky. Anybody else here for the Packers just going to be sits for me. But yeah, if I could go back and re-record this, which I could do if I felt like it, I'd probably just put Romeo Doubs as a low-end start. All right, I'm leaving DK Metcalf as a start. I know he was disappointing this past week. It's not the greatest matchup. The Packers are kind of right there, middle of the pack against wide receivers. They're not great. They're not awful. But just 8 fantasy points against the Bengals in the Unk Bowl. I mean, everybody else was lights out, but Aaron Rodgers only had eyes for tight ends in the red zone, I guess. 5 targets for Metcalf, 3 receptions, 50 receiving yards. His first game since week 1 of the season where he did not score a touchdown. Now, I don't know if he's necessarily going to score a touchdown this week, but I still think he's just a solid start. Once again, maybe closer to a low-end start here, but Metcalf's been solid for majority of the season with 11 or more fantasy points in every game except for this past week, so he is still good enough to give him the start category. Roman Wilson, Calvin Austin, if he plays, whoever it may be at the wide receiver 2 spot here, I'm going to go ahead and just say sit them. Really, it's going like Metcalf, Jaylen Warren to a degree, and then every tight end on this team in terms of the pecking order for receiving work. So at least Metcalf has that going for him. And I think once Calvin Austin is back and fully healthy and everything, he will get back in the mix here. But yeah, we're just sitting the rest of the Steelers wide receivers here in week 8. To wrap things up, we have the Commanders traveling to face the Chiefs for Monday Night Football. Let's start with the Commanders. We got a couple situations going on here. Don't know if Jaden Daniels is going to start in week 8 for the Commanders or not, as he's dealing with that hamstring injury. Don't know if it's going to be him or Marcus Mariota throwing the football. I got to say, if it's Mariota, I don't feel great about the Commanders' offense this week. Traveling to Arrowhead against one of the best defensive coordinators in the league. I still think Deebo Samuel is going to be startable either way, but Deebo missed this past week dealing with that heel injury that, impacted him going into week 6. And he was able to play through it. This past week, he was not. So, yeah, we don't even know if Deebo's going to play. Then we still have not seen Terry McLaurin play since week 3 of the season. So I don't know what's going on with these Commanders wide receivers. I don't know what's going on at the quarterback situation here. So, honestly, I left Deebo as a start, but I've gone kind of back and forth. Maybe he's just a risky flex this week, and I think if Mariota's a quarterback, he can only be viewed as a risky flex coming off of an injury. This is just a bad situation. I think that the Commanders could have a really bad day offensively if Mariota's the starting quarterback. Luke McCaffrey does get the asterisk there. If McLaurin and Deebo miss, maybe, but I feel like Luke McCaffrey benefits when at least one of these wide receivers is on the field, as we saw this past week as he had 2 targets and 0 catches. And I know he doesn't always need a lot of volume. As long as he scores, he's okay. But ultimately, I just don't know if the Commanders are going to have enough offensive output this week to help that. Now, Chris Moore should probably be on the screen there, maybe over Jalen Lane, but then Jalen Lane had an okay day this past week with 9 fantasy points. Chris Moore had 7.9 after he scored a touchdown in week 6. But once again, I really think Deebo or Terry needs to be on the field to really benefit some of these other wide receivers, to kind of take some of that defensive pressure off. These guys are not ready to be wide receiver 1s, and if they are, with a backup quarterback going up against the Chiefs defense, just know Thank you. So Debo, the only guy I'm really viewing as a potential start here in week 8 of the season. All right, that was a headache, but let's look at another headache of a wide receiver room. That's the Chiefs. Now, Rashee Rice is going to make the start category. There's a lot of reports indicating like he's not going to be on the snap count. He's going to be good to go. The Chiefs have a plan for him, and that was certainly true. 10 targets, 7 catches, 42 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 23.2 fantasy points. The Commanders are ranking bottom 12 against opposing wide receivers. You got to feel good here. Fire up Rashee Rice if you own him. But, I was a little bit hesitant going in this past week because we just didn't really know what the volume across the board was going to look like. We still saw Hollywood Brown score a touchdown. He now has 4 touchdowns since week 4. Xavier Worthy, saw the biggest hit, was on the field for 59% of snaps, which was down from the previous week of 73% of snaps, and the week before that, 77% of snaps. 4 targets, 3 catches, 35 receiving yards for him. But I still think Worthy and Hollywood Brown will be in the risky flex area. They can be in your starting lineup here. It's just going to be really difficult to call when they score, when they don't score, what their exact volume overall is going to look like. And we still saw, Travis Kelce get a little bit of involvement. He had a big catch, 3 targets, 3 catches, 8.4 fantasy points. And we can keep going down the pecking order here. Tyquan Thornton had 2 targets. And then don't forget about Juju Smith-Schuster, who had 3 targets. So there's a lot of pieces to this Chiefs offense, and Andy Reid wants to utilize a lot of different players, which is not great for fantasy at the end of the day. But Rashee Rice, going to be a solid start this week. Everybody else up in the air. Worthy and Hollywood Brown can at least be desperation flexes as we move in to week 8. There you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single game, every single wide receiver, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 8 of the fantasy season. And don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach week 8, please drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor. It helps out the channel tremendously when you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our other week 8 fantasy content as the week progresses, because we'll have everything that you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.